Hello, good afternoon. I'm Patrick Schmitt, Master of Wine, Editor-in-Chief at The Drinks Business, and thank you very much for joining me on this virtual masterclass which looks at the rosés of the Paydoc. Now, I've entitled this particular event A Pink Opportunity, and that's because I really see the rosés of the Paydoc as an opportunity, and I'm assuming and hoping that you do too, which is why you're all tuning in. Very briefly, why do I see it as a pink opportunity? That's something I've got to prove to you over the course of the next kind of 45 minutes to an hour. I hope not to be too much longer than that. But essentially, it's because we are in a Mediterranean area, Mediterranean climate, dealing with Mediterranean grapes. We are next door to Provence, down here in the Languedoc-Roussillon, the area of the Paydoc. But we have certain key advantages with the Paydoc compared to Provence, and that really relates to three things in my mind. One is the scale of the area. This is a vast region. The second is the diversity. Because of that scale, the range of terroirs gives you choice, stylistic variation. And the final thing is the Paydoc has a very free approach to winemaking. There's freedom, and with that comes choice. So that's why I see this as a pink opportunity. And of course, if you add scale, diversity, freedom, you can also put in there affordability or relative affordability. There aren't the supply constraints that you get with, let's say, the Côte de Provence when you're dealing with an area as large as the Paydoc. But that's just my brief introduction. This is how I'm hoping to plan this webinar over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. First of all, I'm just going to do a little look at why rosé. The opportunity is there in this category, but where and why, and then why Paydoc, or really why Paydoc rosé. And that's just going to go through a few of the advantages that this particular classification offers you as wine buyers. And then the proof will hopefully be in the wines. When it comes to the wines, which are all in front of me, I hope you all have samples. I think it's interesting to see them here now before me, that they're all pretty much the same colour. Maybe that's a little bit disappointing with some of you, but I think for those with a kind of commercial hat on, it's probably quite a good thing. As we know, the consumer, certainly in the UK at the moment, is looking for this kind of pale ballet shoe pink style of rosé, as made famous by Provence. And the wines that you're seeing, I have actually chosen, in a way, not trying to blow my own trumpet at all, but this masterclass was really my idea, because what we've been doing is a focus. I've been doing a focus recently on the wines of the Paydoc. In fact, I've done 3 different masterclasses, and it seemed to me that an area that really deserved a closer look, because of the growth of the rosé sector, were specifically rosés from the Paydoc. And to do that, I really needed to come up with a selection for you. So I did a semi-blind tasting of about 70 plus rosés from the Paydoc, and from that selected, in fact, 10 for you to look at today. And that was selection based on the wines I thought were best, but also a little bit of variation, so they weren't just all Grenache rosés, for a bit of interest and excitement. And that's what you're seeing for you. I say 10, actually they're now 9. 10 would have been an easy number, 9's very manageable. One of them, in fact, a Pic Poule Noir, turned out wasn't a Paydoc in the end. I think it was a Vin de France, so we pushed that to one side. But that's what you're looking at, that's how they were chosen, and that's the purpose of today. Okay, so why rosé? I mean, you all know that this is a growth category. You work in the trades, but I just think it's interesting to see quite how big it's become, or important it's become. If you think it was around 8% of the total global wine market, the kind of turn of this century, it's now a little over 10% today. So it's really increased its share, and that's against the backdrop of a market overall for wine that isn't really increasing. More recently, we looked at a lot of categories during the pandemic, recent history. We want to stay relevant. How has rosé fared during the COVID crisis when it's grown? And I mean, this isn't really a time to talk about generally about the rosé category, but I think, you know, it's fairly clear that people have been enjoying refreshing, high quality, slightly spoiling wines at home to cheer themselves up. It may have benefited from people drinking less sparkling wine, or certainly less champagne. And also last year during lockdown, the weather was fantastic. I am going to talk quite a little bit about Provence because that's relevant. It is the benchmark. It is the region that's really driven the growth of dry, pale, premium rosé. I'm talking about quite high-priced rosé. And I suppose if you want to look, I've mentioned sparkling wine already. Provence is to rosé what champagne really is to sparkling wine. It's the benchmark. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has to mimic Provence in style. It's just to kind of become a quality benchmark. And actually, if we draw that comparison with champagne, you have a lot of places in the world, New World Sparkling, English Fizz, producing sparkling wines of similar quality to champagne, but not necessarily similar style. And that's a good thing. You know, champagne does a very good job at what it does. There's no point other regions trying to mimic that, except trying to learn the techniques to make things of a similar quality. So Provence, about 56 million in the UK off-trade, that's last year's figure. And then I just want to point out that, you know, the really growth market for rosé is the US, where for Provence particularly, because I had figures for this, it's about double the size it is in the UK. But back to the UK, if we deal with the overall off-trade, so that's retail only, we're parking the on-trade at the moment, badly tracked really for wine figures. But if we just look at the retail sector, it's about 560 million in terms of value for rosé, which is 10 times the size of that figure I just quoted for Provence. So I don't want you to think rosé is only Provence. I'm sure you don't. But even though it's the benchmark, actually a lot of the volume sales of rosé in the UK don't come from Provence, even if it's the benchmark and it sets the image, and particularly it's been so influential on the colour of rosé in recent history. The other thing is the future. It's important to consider the growth. This is not a category that's dwindling, dying, plateauing. The UK market is still an area that's in growth. There may be a little bit of saturation now on the shelves. That may be occurring, but it's not a category in decline. But the global picture is very positive. The US market is still looking ripe for growth, but Asia is a market that certainly Provence has got its sights set on, particularly for premium rosé, and barely tapped, as we know it's mainly, if we're looking at China, a red wine market. Languedoc, though, I mentioned Provence and I mentioned volumes. Languedoc is the actual becoming the engine room for growth for French rosé overall. Excuse me, coughing. And we're looking at about 55% more made in the Languedoc than actually made in Provence in the last year. Now, why the Paydoc? I think it's really important to look at the kind of general picture when it comes to the Paydoc, because I think it's a really exciting wine for wine region generally. 1 second, take some water. Very exciting generally for wine of all types, because it's large, it's diverse, it's got a fantastic climate for viticulture. And it's a kind of playground really, because it has fairly free rules. Winemakers and negociants can have some fun when it comes to what they plant, what they choose to blend. It's also the home of varietal wines, and that really is the key cue, certainly for the UK consumer, is buying grape by variety. The other thing is, because it's a hot, dry part of France with a lot of cooling and drying winds, it's a very good place for organic grape growing, and I think that's something we're going to look at with these rosés here, is that pretty much all of them are made in a low intervention manner, and a few of them are organic too. So we have in the Languedoc-Roussillon region, under the Paydoc classification, an opportunity to tick a number of boxes, because we can do the pale rosé, the dry style, the Mediterranean grapes from a historic wine region, and certified organic wines. Should that be something you're looking for, and should that be something the customer's happy to maybe pay a bit more for. I mentioned that I've done a few masterclasses already on the Paydoc, but just to bear in mind that there's some other strengths of the region that kind of overlap with rosé, but it is an area of varietal wines. So unlike Provence, where it's a blend, rosés are made with a blend of grapes. Here you might have 100% Grenache, 100%, we have a 100% Petit Verdot rosé here. That's allowed under Paydoc, even in this Mediterranean climate. And then you've got sustainable wine production. And then you've got some stuff that's a bit fun, that's a bit esoteric. Because of those relaxed rules, you see things that are a bit unusual that you might not find elsewhere. And I think that's fun because it may be that you're looking not for a Provence look-alike at a cheaper price, but actually something completely different to keep the interests up of your consumers and I suppose carve out a niche for yourself. Paydoc, 25% more rosé than Provence. That's what it sells at the moment. And the Paydoc rosés, most of them are varietal wines, so that really ties in what I was saying earlier in contrast to those from Provence. We're looking mostly at the classic grapes of the region, Mediterranean grapes that suit making lovely, fresh, fruity styles of rosé, so Grenache, Cinsault and Syrah, also a bit of Vermentino in their white grape, known as Rolle in this part of France. And actually, it's something that the Provençal rosé producers have really perfected is the co-fermentation. So I'm getting a bit geeky here, but of Grenache and Rolle, so the red grape and the white grapes, and it helps kind of fix the colour of the rosé and also provide some stability in the wine. Rolle, the Vermentino, having quite a naturally low pH, as well as providing that kind of citric freshness. So as I've said here, the climate and the terroir between Provence and the Paydoc region of the Languedoc-Roussillon are very similar. Provence does have their edge on in terms of reputation and quality. It's been making rosé, specifically rosé, and focused on rosé for a lot longer, so that's fair. But yields in Provence, they're capped a little bit lower. As I said, the Paydoc is freer. So the combination of the larger area and those higher yields in the Paydoc means that there aren't the same supply constraints when it comes to rosé. And that's very important when it comes to pricing, as we know, or rather I know from watching, and I'm sure you know from buying, whether you look at bulk wine prices or prices on shelf, particularly of leading brands from Provence, they've they've gradually moved up, and something like take a brand like Whispering Angel. I remember it launching in the market sort of between £15 discounted down to sort of 11, 12, 13 pounds. Now it's up at 19, 20 pounds and discounted maximum down to 17. So it's really moved up in price, and the cost of making wine in Provence has gone up, which of course is forcing people to look outside. And there's this idea that you're not in Provence, maybe you're Pinot Grigio Blanche or Navarran Rosé. Well, actually, you don't have to look very far outside Provence. You just have to go to the neighbouring region to find something similar style, quality, colour at a more affordable price. The history of the Paydoc, this is just very brief, but just so you know, it is quite a young classification. 1987 were the first wines to carry the Paydoc name on the label with Fortin de France, and now it's huge. If it was 80,000 bottles back in the 80s, late 80s, now it's over 800 million. 2009 it became a PGI, so Protected Geographic Indicator. Now the Paydoc is a classification for wines within the Languedoc-Roussillon. It's a vast area, 120,000 hectares, so put that in comparison about the size of Bordeaux. But that's drawing on a much larger area, so 240,000 hectares. So I mentioned Languedoc being vast, being a kind of playground. We're really looking at a vast area in which to draw from. 88 million cases, so it's as much wine as Argentina. So yeah, it's really vast. Now, what's important is the split in production. Paydoc is mostly red, but actually produces more rosé than white. So almost 30% of the production of the Paydoc is pink wine. So that represents around 160 million bottles. Produced in Provence, whereas there are 228 million produced in under the Paydoc classification from the Languedoc-Roussillon. A lot of cooperatives there as well, which is good for sourcing good wine at a scale, made with state-of-the-art equipment. Image. We know Provence has this fantastic image: the poolside, the med, the lavender, the beaches, all the rest of it. Well, that image is true too for the Languedoc-Roussillon. It has this wonderful Mediterranean image, and the vines go right down to the coast, but they also, you have these Cathar castles, these rocky outcrops, the castles at the top. You've got Carcassonne, again, they're vineyards that almost reach the walls of this fortified city. And there's so much to draw on if you're looking at wine imagery and branding. So it's a really stunning part of the Med. Diversity is one of the key points I mentioned at the beginning. This is a large area. It covers a lot of different terroir types. Now look here, if you look at this map, you can see that the Languedoc-Roussillon is right next door to Provence. So that's a kind of simplified map of the French wine regions. But it's very important, I think, to see the way Provence there is on the coast, and then you head a little bit further west and you've got the Languedoc-Roussillon area. But with that diversity, what you've got is you've got a lot of influences. You've got maritime influence, you've got mountain influences, you've got a lot of different types of subsoil based on different bedrocks, from sandstones to gravels to limestone clays to schist, volcanic soils. So that's important as well when it comes to diversity, when it comes to blending, when it comes to looking for specific characters, when it comes to different grape varieties. And then, of course, with that different geography is a lot of different microclimates. And 200 kilometres of beaches as well. And that's important to remember if you have that Provençal image stuck in your head of the kind of Côte d'Azur of France. Well, you know, the beaches are here too. And this was just a map to show you the mountain ranges, because the Languedoc is tucked away in that corner of the coast there. But if you see, there are three big mountain ranges, the Massif Central, the Alps and the Pyrenees. And what they do is they create a kind of backdrop to the Languedoc-Roussillon. So it's like an amphitheatre facing the sea. And I think that's important because it gets the cool winds from the mountains above it, and then the sea breezes from the Med, which are important moderating influence in this very hot part of France. Summer temperatures up over 35 degrees. And I've mentioned here as many as 4 different winds. It's very important for fresh rosé production. You want a natural acidity in the wines. And I notice, you know, with rosé, you get a lot of cues on the branding talking about either the seaside, the coast, or the mountains, whatever the country they're sourced from. And you have here in the Paydoc both those influences, so you can draw on the idea of the cooling influence of the mountains, the rugged nature of those hillsides, as well as the kind of beauty spots and blue seas of the Med. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity, and also there's a lot of organic grape growing. 67 million bottles certified organic, so it's actually the largest production area for organic wine in all of France. There's also this element of authenticity. The oldest vineyards really can be traced back to this part of France. The vine actually entered France through the town of Narbonne, and this was where the first vineyards were planted. So it's a really authentic, historic, ancient winemaking region. This is not, the Paydoc may be a new classification, but we're not dealing with a new terroir. It's been making wine here for centuries, particularly up in the hillsides. The Romans chose because, you know, nothing else would grow but vines. Very arid, rugged climate, low fertility in the soils. And the other thing I think to mention is that the classic Mediterranean and classic grapes for making rosé of Mourvèdre, Grenache, Syrah, were in fact the grapes that were being used here, grown here by the Romans all those centuries ago. So they're naturally very well adapted. They suit the climate. They suit the dry conditions. But, you know, the Paydoc a lot of it is about varietal labelling, and it's about experimenting with international grapes to tap into current commercial trends. So, you know, why not have a varietal Pinot Noir rosé, for instance? That way, you know, playing on the popularity of Pinot Noir, and it's a grape that suits a lovely style of rosé. And you can do it and label it Paydoc, which, you know, ties the grape variety to the place, rather than just a Vin de France, which would just be a grape variety without any particular link to anything other than the country. Quality control as well. It is a classification. There are quality controls. There are controls on yields, production, and there are controls on winemaking quality. And it's interesting because I tasted about 75, 80 wines before making the selection, and I didn't taste any wines that were faulty. I didn't taste anything I'd kick out of the glass. They were all of a good quality. It's just some gave me more pleasure than others, but the quality was high. There weren't any faults, certainly. Organics, I think it's important to mention organics. It is a growing trend along with rosé, and you put the two together, and I think it's a very powerful proposition. And you know, organics is big. I mean, they're talking about about 1 billion bottles of organic wine are expected to be consumed around the world in the next couple of years. So that's doubling from what it was, you know, almost a decade ago. It's a growth market. We know the trends. Consumers are desiring organics, low intervention, sustainable management, whether it's fruit, meat, or in this case grapes for wine. So the key is about the Paydoc is that because of that climate, because of the winds, because of the arid nature, the low disease pressure, this is a region that's able to produce organically grown grapes and fairly affordably. You know, they haven't got risks of rainfall during the growing season that might cause a lot of rot and require a lot of sprays, and an organic viticultural setting might lead to you dropping yields to such a low level that it no longer becomes a sustainable model for selling wine at a low price. And varietal wines, I've mentioned this already. 2/3 of all wine in the UK is varietally labelled, so it might be that you feel that you want to strengthen your rosé offer by going the varietal route, so it's not just pale and pink in these flint glass bottles, but it also proudly states the grape it's made from. This you can't do with the Côte de Provence rosé, which I said are blends, but you could do it with Paydoc. And I think it's interesting to think of some of the biggest plantings in the Paydoc. You know, Merlot is the most planted, but Pinot Noir, there's a lot of Pinot Noir down here. And I mention that because Pinot is good for rosé. But also, if you're listening to me now and you're thinking, oh, I hadn't thought about sourcing Pinot from the Paydoc, you might be looking for some cheaper alternative to increasingly expensive Bourgogne Rouge. And, you know, the Paydoc is a good place to go and have a look. Marcelin, we'll look at that shortly. It's a Grenache Cabernet cross, but it's a grape of interest in relation to rosé as well as red wines, but I think it really makes very good rosé. It's naturally quite high acid grape that's been bred for disease resistance as well as drought tolerance. So it makes a lot of sense in this climate, and because it's quite a fruity style of wine with that natural high acidity, it's perfectly suited for rosé. And in fact, one of the rosés I really liked in the tastings, I said it was semi-blind, then turned out to be made with Marcelin, and I thought that's interesting, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it. I'm not going to talk too much about the other grapes, but I think, you know, there's a little bit of everything down here. Carignan is another interesting grape to look at that's well suited to the climate. These are the most planted. Syrah, Grenache, Merlot, Cabernet dominate. Down there, there's Chardonnay a bit further down, not relevant to rosé, but again, another grape there's a lot of planted. There's a lot of Sauvignon Blanc as well down in the Paydoc. And this is more relevant for today because we look at that central column and you see that's production. Most of the rosés from the Paydoc are based around Grenache, which really is the king of grapes for rosé, as well as Mourvèdre or Monastrell down in Spain. But Grenache Noir just seems to produce naturally, lend itself to making delicate, pale, bright, fruity, juicy rosés, and of course delicious reds. And then Cinsault, Syrah, Merlot, Pinot, Cabernet, Cabernet Franc, you can see down there. Marcelin, some way down. There's even Petit Verdot and Sangiovese on that list. As you can see there, you know, there's a little bit of everything with the Paydoc, which I think makes it fun. Now, before we taste, I just thought it was important to sort of look at these wines in context of what's really going on in the UK market when it comes to rosé on the shelves. Some of you may be buying for some of the supermarkets that I looked at before doing this masterclass, so you know your own ranges better than I do. But I think, you know, at the very bottom end of the market, what have we got? We've got these kind of generic rosés. They're often not that pale, actually. There's one I've pictured at the bottom there, which is the juicy rosé on the shelves of Tesco that's costing around £3.50 and has been line priced to match the discounters. But it's from Spain, and, you know, Spain is traditionally the source of cheapest wine in Europe, and fruity, quite brightly coloured rosé, perfect for that, to go to Spain. Then you have the kind of some of the blush rosés from California. I haven't pictured here. There's still the kind of Blossom Hills, the White Zins, that again are quite expensive, and part of the market that's still quite big but not considered as fashionable. They're slightly off dry, and we're dealing really with dry rosé here today. Then in the kind of mid-market, there's quite a bit of generic Spanish rosé, but also I've noticed quite a lot more Pinot Grigio blush, as they call it, so pink Pinot Grigio. That seems to be a strong part of the market, and I see it on restaurant lists as well and by the glass, so that's strong in the US. But that's the kind of mid-market, as long as some South African, Portuguese, some sort of New World, some Argentine Malbec rosé seems to be growing as well a little bit in presence. And then the top end, and I say top end, sort of 12 to 20 pounds, so really well and truly over 10 quid, and you rarely find Provençal rosé now discounted below £10. Okay, the discounters do have, so it's not Côte de Provence, but some Provençal rosés a little bit cheaper. But we're really dealing with sort of 12 to 20 pounds, and I think Whispering Angel that should be credited with really growing the scale, the fashionability, the scope of Provençal rosé worldwide, is now really become quite pricey, and Moet Hennessy have bought a controlling share of the brand. And it's an amazing success story. But as I said earlier, I remember it being in the market around £15 headline price. Now it's £19-20, and I see that what Whispering Angel done is they've brought in a new variant, Palm by Whispering Angel, that's now at the price that Whispering Angel was when it launched in the UK market. So that's kind of what we're up against. On the left, my top left, maybe your top right, is a Paydoc rosé. And rather fun label, and that is Aldi, that's gone really big on Paydoc rosé, and they know how to source wine. They're very savvy, and I think it says a lot that they've gone to the Paydoc, and I think that kind of opportunity that I was talking about at the beginning is something they've spotted. And you combine the large scale of the region, the affordable wine production, the Mediterranean grapes there, and then of course some of the large producers, particularly the big co-ops, and actually put those things together, and it's good for making a very affordable, clean, good quality, good value rosé. But I don't want you to think of the Paydoc as just cheap, and it's not, and actually a lot of these wines are not that cheap, but they represent good value and good relative value, which I think is a very important concept to consider, as well as being stylistically on trend. But you'll taste and see if you agree with me shortly. But I just thought it was a point saying that actually, do you know what the most expensive still rosé is in the world? We're not all together, so I can't have a show of hands. For me, it's that strange sensation of talking into a camera. And by the way, talking about not being a show of hands, so I'm going to keep you on an element of suspense for a bit longer. But if there are questions, do put them in the chat function. I'm hoping that my team can show them to me later, and I'll try and address some of them for you at the end of the presentation, rather than as we go along. So just a bit complicated to be doing that. If I can't answer the questions, if they're technical, we can put them to the wine producers or someone senior at the Paydoc, and we can get back to you over email. And if you do need to email me directly, it is just patrick@thedrinksbusiness.com. So the world's most expensive rosé, it's not actually from Provence, it's from the Languedoc. So it's from this area where the Paydoc is sourcing wine. It's not a Paydoc, but it is labelled as a Languedoc. It's actually from a region called Cabrières, which is kind of near Saint-Chinian, and it's a lovely rocky schist, bedrock-based part of the Languedoc that produces very high-quality reds, but in this case an absolutely stunning rosé by Gérard Bertrand, who is the most prominent champion of the wines of the Languedoc, and particularly of fine, pale, dry rosés from the Languedoc rather than Provence. His Hampton Water that he does with John Bon Jovi, which is one of the many celebrity-backed rosé brands, but one of the very few that is a Languedoc rosé and not a Provençal rosé. So Gérard Bertrand's a big promoter of the Languedoc as a source of great dry rosés. And here he has in the Languedoc a rosé that's made from those native Mediterranean grapes, also a bit of Mourvèdre, Viognier thrown in there. It's biodynamic, and it's £200 a bottle. and it is, that's bloody expensive, but you're drinking these things, maybe, smart pale rosés on yachts on the Riviera where people might otherwise be drinking, I don't know, Cristal rosé. So compared to some of those very fine prestige cuvee pink champagnes, it's not more expensive. But the other thing is it taps into that trend that is niche but emerging of fine, food-friendly, possibly age-worthy rosés that are made like a fine white Burgundy or a very fine white Bordeaux, in the sense that they're barrel fermented and aged. And I think it's a fascinating category. I get very excited by some of the wines if they're well done, as long as they're still crisp and fresh. I'm less keen on those that have been aged in barrels and taken a kind of oxidative characters on, but we're going to look at one anyway in this tasting, so hold on to that thought. But the most expensive dry still rosé in the world is in fact from the Languedoc, and with that said, we know the potential is there. Let's start our tasting. And wine 1, Calmal and Joseph, named after the two winemakers who got together to produce this brand and domain back in 1995. Very good quality makers, that do a lot of Paydoc. I featured their wines before in masterclasses. Tasted this, again, bagged up, didn't know who was behind it necessarily, and scored it highly and just thought it was a lovely style of rosé. So yeah, screw cap, whether you think that's a good thing or not, I'm not here to judge, but it's worth noting. Now, it's quite interesting because it's actually dominated by Grenache Gris, which is I think it's really interesting. People talk a lot about Grenache Noir, and obviously for rosé, and you take the colour from the skins, but here you've got a pink-skinned form of Grenache that tends to yield quite an oily style of wine. I've shown in the past some Grenache Gris white wines, and they're quite rich, a little bit oilier and richer than Grenache Blanc. And I think it's an interesting thing. It's a bit of a novelty. There's not much of it planted. It suits the climate in the region, and it produces this wine, this style of wine, that to me is oily, it's quite rich, it's quite textural. I don't know if there's any residual sugar in it. Certainly, I'm told it's a dry wine, but I almost detect there's a little bit of residual sugar in there. But part of that kind of mouth-filling texture that you get, slight creaminess, often you get that from a little bit of residual sugar, but in this case also is a character of Grenache Gris. It gives that kind of textural style of wine. I think makes for something very attractive. I think in rosé what I like is something that's quite soft, it's fresh, but slightly oily, with a crisp finish. There's something that I find a bit disappointing about some roses when they really try and create something very pale and delicate. They can be a bit hollow, sometimes a bit herbaceous, a bit hard. I think, rosé should be pleasurable, it should be soft, even though it finishes fresh. And I think this wine achieves that very nicely. Sub 10 quid retail. So I would say it's similar in style and quality to Provence, maybe a bit oilier, and relatively more affordable. And these are headline prices I'm talking about, not discounts. So I hope you like that. It's a good starting point. Okay, this wine from Negociant. The brand is called La Maruette. Now this is an example of what the Paydoc does do well, because it is 100% Grenache. So this is about, what I was saying earlier, 90% of all the wines, red, white and rosé, produced from the Paydoc are varietal wines, so made with just one grape variety and labelled as such. And here's an example in rosé. Again, lovely wine. Tasted that again without knowing who was behind it. Liked it. A little bit more delicate compared to the last wine we had. A little bit leaner, doesn't have that same oiliness. Maybe there's no residual sugar here, or maybe it's the effect or the absence of the Grenache Gris, because this is Grenache Noir. but delicate, fine, well made, clean, quite light, but a pretty simple, bright, fresh, good rosé at a low price. And an example that I'm really pleased that I liked, because it illustrates what I was saying earlier, which is that, you know, you can have these amazingly affordable, very well made, delicious wines from the Paydoc, whether they're rosé, white or red, that are organic, certified organic. In fact, the Maruette brand is just for organic grapes, and yet, you know, it's at around £5. So I think that's a real bonus. So if your mindset or your wine list or your positioning as an independent merchant, or it's a section, you're looking for an organic section, you know, here you've got a rosé that ticks the box of being organic and well made and affordable. I don't think there's much more to say about that. It's not a complex wine, but it's well made. Okay, so this is a Co-op Richemont. This is an interesting wine from my perspective. Let's taste it. I'm going to taste it anyway, again in front of you before talking about it. Yeah. Right. So when I chose the wines, whenever I'm assessing wines, I'm assessing for quality and then writing about style. And with these wines I've selected, they all reached a certain standard of quality, but they came in a different style. I wasn't thinking, I want a wine that looks like Provençal rosé. I was thinking, I want a well-made wine, happens to be pink, and comes from the Paydoc. And this wine, I think, is quite different from the first two. It's a little bit more jammy in style in terms of flavours and aromas to me. If the others were kind of, you know, peach and citrus and delicate, this is a bit more kind of strawberry jam, maybe a little bit of bubble gum, but it's sort of open. It's juicy. It's slightly sweet tasting. It's in a way, it's a little bit obvious, but I rather like that about it, and I still think it's refreshing. I think it's bright. It ticks the box of being pale and delicate and dry, and it's made with this grape I mentioned earlier called Marselan. And I think that's really interesting because it's something a bit different. It's a grape variety that certainly some producers, and particularly this Co-op down in the Paydoc, in the Languedoc, is trying to promote, because Marselan is a cross that was done down near the town of Marselan in the Languedoc, a cross in the 60s between Grenache and Cabernet, specifically designed to make fruity, juicy, good wines that were drought resistant and disease resistant. So really, you know, tapping into what we're looking at now, which is sustainable winemaking. People talk about how to do it. Well, you know, maybe you might have to change the grape variety being used. And Marselan thrives down the south of France. The problem is it's quite hard to sell. You know, people, if they're looking for a variety on the label, are going for something well known with a strong image, whether it's Grenache or Pinot Noir or whatever else, maybe Malbec, as I mentioned earlier, and rosés is growing. Marselan doesn't really have any of those, that reputation, doesn't have any image at all really. But it makes really nice wine. I think if you can try a really pretty rosé made with Marselan with lots of fruit and freshness, then it's a good way to promote the grape. And incidentally, you know, if you are interested in Marselan, it's really taken off in China. And I think, you know, some sort of the big decanter trophies and things have been given to reds made with Marselan that are seemingly producing better quality wines in places like Ningxia than Cabernet or, you know, classic Bordeaux grapes. And that's because it's a tough grape. As I said, is good in dry climates, good disease resistance, and ripens late and retains acidity. So there are lots of things to rate, reasons to rate it, but it's quite easy to be a snob about a cross made in the 60s with a little, you know, it's little known, bit of a niche, but actually produces lovely rosés, so worth bearing in mind, and particularly with this idea of sustainable winemaking in mind. So yeah, I hope you like that, something a bit different. That's another wine under screw cap and from a Co-op, so produced potentially, I would imagine, on quite a large scale, and they are the specialist producers of Marselan. Okay, wine 4, the Serre de Guéry. These piété, French accent being terrible, but piety, I suppose. So this sort of holy wine. It's again from a lovely producer. I've shown their wines before from the Paydoc, and so I was very pleased to see this wine, this rosé was made by them. Quite low alcohol as well, I noticed on these wines. I think some of those Grenache-based rosés, whether they're from Spain, Priorat, or Provence, and particularly the top-end wines from the Chateau d'Esclans, who are the people who make Whispering Angel, you know, we're 14.5%. Here we're at 12.5%, so they're pale, they're delicate, they're fruity, they're ripe, and they aren't going to kind of knock you over the head. It's quite easy to get caught out with rosé when it's refreshing, delicate and dry, and 14% ABV. I'm sure you have far more self-control than me. I should just speak for myself. So yeah, so they're based in the Minevois, but they're making here a rosé to the Paydoc classification because they're having a bit of fun. They're breaking the rules of the Minevois. I'm not sure the Minevois actually allows rosé anyway. Maybe I need to check, but they are using Malbec, and that's a grape associated with the southwest of France and indeed the southwest of the Languedoc, but not the Minevois. And Malbec, I would imagine, brings a bit of colour and spice. I think this wine does have a kind of salty, almost slightly sort of white peppery finish to it. I think it's quite complex, it's dry, it's fresh, it's quite delicate, but it's ripe, it's smooth, and I think it's a lovely, interesting rosé. It looks very pretty, and I really enjoyed it. I thought there was, you know, a sort of almost like an apple-like bite to it after a lot of kind of soft peach and strawberry fruit at the core. So I thought it had a very nice balance. And again, you know, not an expensive wine, and you know, made with traditional Mediterranean grapes and Mediterranean climate. So last time I did them, I did present a wine when we looked at some of the more funky stuff from the Paydoc. They did make 100% Petit Verdot that's absolutely delicious. So that's the Serre de Guéry Paydoc from the Chateau Guéry in Minevois. Okay, so wine 5, the Villa Noria. So I'm talking about the strengths of the Paydoc. I mentioned organics, and I've mentioned varietally labelled wines, like we have the 100% Grenache, and we'll look at 100% Petit Verdot shortly. But also the other thing I've talked about, hopefully, and conveyed to you, is freedom to experiment, to have fun. And this is a really good example of that. Again, I chose this wine without knowing what the cepage was. I chose it because I liked it. I thought it was a good expression of Paydoc rosé. High quality, well made, delicate, and pretty wine. And then it turns out that it's a Pinot Noir and Grenache blend, and not just Grenache Noir, but Grenache Gris as well. And I mean, I don't think I've ever had a rosé with that combination of grapes before, and it's really interesting. And you can do that in the Paydoc, and why not? You know, Pinot Noir is a great grape for making rosé. There's a lot of it planted down here. It produces quite a fruity style of red wine, but equally it makes a very fruity style of rosé. And combine it with Grenache to produce something like this. A certain delicacy, the Pinot Noir bringing a bit of balance, a bit of freshness as well. And actually, who really cares what went into the blend? From us, from a kind of nerdy wine trade perspective, it's quite fun to find out, but from the consumer perspective, they don't mind as long as it's well made. And in the case of this, it actually produces a really nice style of rosé, I think, and I hope you agree. But you know, I noticed in this there was a little bit of kind of almost like red currant bite to it, so it wasn't just peachy, soft crushed strawberry. And I wonder whether some of that kind of smaller sort of currant style crunchy fruit could have come from the Pinot Noir as well, so that you have a lovely balance in that wine, but with a bit of texture to it. It's not too lean. It's got some fruit weight. So I like that. I thought that was interesting. And there is another advantage to it, which one can see down there on the bottle. There's a little certification. Again, this is another wine that's not just one of those estates where they're saying, oh, we're growing grapes organically or we're growing grapes with low intervention. This is actually certified organic. And there you are, you have a lovely pale pink rosé, extractively packaged. You've got the flint glass, the deep punt, a good style of wine, right wine, and it's organic and it's below 10 quid. So I think that hopefully illustrates a little bit of why I think the Paydoc does represent a pink opportunity. Okay, now for something a bit different, a bit funky, a bit unusual. We don't want to just do pale pink rosés. This has got a bit more colour to it, not much, and it's made with 100% Petit Verdot. As I said, I rated it as being a nice fruity rosé without knowing what the grape variety was, but having seen it was 100% Petit Verdot, it piqued my interest, and I hope it does yours too. So I've talked quite a bit about one of the strengths of Paydoc being diversity, and this proves, I hope, that point. It's a grape that you don't expect, not usually making varietal wines. And here it's being used to make quite a deeply coloured rosé with quite a lot of fruit and expression, juiciness, bit of sweetness, but also to show that actually you don't need to go for one style of rosé with the Paydoc. And I do actually think, or would like to see a little bit more diversity in terms of rosé style or French rosé style on the shelves of wine retailers or in restaurants, because we know what Provence does very well. And we don't want the whole world to be Provençal rosé. It's one of the things that we love about wine is that there's variation and diversity. And just because it's rosé, it's a category defined by colour, doesn't mean you can't have variation in style. And this to me is a different style of rosé and no less attractive than the delicate, dry, leaner style that you might find from Provence or in some of the other wines. It's using a different grape, and it's richer and it's fruitier, and it would be great with, I don't know, summertime barbecued meat or sausages, because it's got a bit more power to it. But Petit Verdot is interesting as well. It's a great variety associated with the southwest of France, primarily with Bordeaux, where it's used as a kind of seasoning really in the great reds of the left bank, because it brings a bit of colour, spice, acidity, tannin to the wine's structure, but it ripens very late. It's very hard to ripen fully in a climate like Bordeaux. Down the Languedoc, as long as it's not too dry, it doesn't like drought, but as long as it's not too dry, it loves the climate because it's hot. It's a long growing season, so you can grow Petit Verdot to full ripeness. And in fact, it makes very good varietal red wine in the Languedoc with a lot of structure, spice, juice, and interest. And here it's being used to make a very nice rosé, naturally, natural high acidity in this late ripening grape. Grown on volcanic soil as well, I see here. So there are some volcanic soils in the Languedoc-Roussillon area as well, if that's something that you think is important for promoting wine. Or rosé in particular. Okay, wine number 7. This is in fact the second time I've shown this wine, not deliberately, because both times I've selected on the basis purely of quality without knowing who's behind it. So I'm glad that it's here again, because it's a really safe bet. Yeah, and it's still showing beautifully in my view. I love the look of it as well. Really nice package, and I think that's very important. Image is vital with rosé, as I say, you drink with your eyes, and that is a bottle I think you'd want to grab off the shelf. It looks to me very premium. It's just comes in below 10 quid UK retail. Taking some of the cues from those Provençal rosé producers that do similar effects on their flint glass. It's not actually made with the traditional Mediterranean grapes of this part of the world, but true to the Paydoc experimental approach and use of commercially relevant grapes and blending things in a slightly unusual manner. It's taking the grapes of Bordeaux, Merlot and Cabernet and blending them with the grape of Burgundy, being Pinot Noir. So very unusual, but the result I think is delicious. It's fresh, It's quite delicate, but it's not thin. A little bit of peachiness, and then this kind of slightly kind of juicy pink grapefruit zest on the finish. I really think it's delicious. And I think, you know, there's something else about this estate, which is that it's organic. So again, it's one of those examples where you've got something of quality that's ticking all the boxes in terms of colour, style, appearance, and then it's organic too, and it just squeezes in around or below that £10 kind of psychological barrier. So yeah, in a way, you don't really need to worry about the fact that's a Paydoc or not. It's just a great example of French rosé, and it's something that I would very happily be stocking up on for this summer myself. So yeah, I hope you like that. Number 8. So we're getting near the end now. Domaine Valensac. I don't know an enormous amount about this producer, but they are very respected, and they make lovely whites and reds. And obviously I stumbled across the rosé in that big tasting, and I thought they were very good too. So I think this is something that perhaps should have a bit more exposure and distribution in this market. Yeah, it's got that sort of peaches and cream character. It's not seen any oak, I don't think, but there's a richness and a sweetness and a juiciness, and then a vibrancy. It's got a nice bite to the finish, almost a tiny bit of kind of like salty, grippy character to it. Maybe that bit of skin contact's leached a few tannins, but I like that. It gives a dryness to the finish. Syrah and Grenache, so here's dominated by Syrah, so a slight change there. Maybe that's why we're getting a bit more grit, possibly a bit more colour, a bit more bite to the wine, as you would associate with a Syrah grape. But yeah, I think that's a really good example of rosé from the Paydoc. Quite a funky, modern-looking label. It's dry, it's bright, it's pale, but it's quite juicy. If I had that blind, okay, you might think it was from Provence, but it is slightly different from your standard Provençal rosé. I think a bit more texture, a bit more grip to it, but a very nice wine. It'd be great with food. And another example of the quality and value for money you get with Paydoc rosé just by stepping a very short way outside Provence. I don't want to knock Provence, because Provence is fantastic for many reasons. It's just if you're looking for something a bit cheaper at a similar quality that you can consider the Paydoc. But let's not talk anything more about things being cheap, because we're moving on to a final wine that isn't cheap, not by Provençal rosé standards and not by rosé standards. We're looking at about £20 here. I think that's important to show that the Paydoc can do fine wines and position itself at the level of a fine wine, or certainly a fine rosé, because why shouldn't it? Just because the classification is very free and it covers a large area doesn't mean you can't use it to make fine wines. And here they'd need to use Paydoc because this rosé is made with Pinot Gris and Vermentino, and those are grapes that wouldn't be allowed for making rosé under the Languedoc or the classification or any of the appellations of the area, and it wouldn't be allowed if they were over in Provence either. So they're using the grapes that they think work well with the style of rosé. They're having a bit of fun, they're making a high quality wine, and they're calling it Paydoc because they're allowed to work with these grapes and make this style of wine under that classification. When you stick your nose in that, it is a bit of a shock. If you imagine that this could have ended up being a Pinot Grigio, Pinot Gris of course being one and the same as Pinot Grigio, people have in their head Pinot Grigio being a light, delicate white wine. Here we've got quite an oily, rich wine with very clearly oak influence. And when I tasted this wine, I didn't know there were any barrel-influenced rosés in my lineup, so I just instantly creamy oak. This must be barrel fermented or influenced. And sure enough, when later I looked it up, I had some difficulty finding out the details on this wine. It had been. Now, you may be trying this and thinking, oh, I don't like that, or that's an amazing find, or isn't that interesting with lots of character, I'm not sure it's my thing. It doesn't really matter. I like it. I have tried it on other people and it does divide opinion, as I think always is the case with barrel fermented rosés. My feeling is that you have barrel fermented whites, you have barrel fermented reds. Why shouldn't you have barrel fermented rosés? It does require skilled handling to be able to create something like this. And I think it's a shame if there's a barrel influence in a rosé and you lose the fruit character, you lose some of the brightness, and if you get some of the oxidative effects on the wine, so you get slightly faded or bruised characters. With this wine, I get fresh, ripe, oily peach and pear fruit, and then I get oak flavours too. I suppose if there was a criticism, you would say that the two haven't kind of melded yet fully together. You can taste the two sides of the wine quite clearly, but I like the flavours. I think they're complementary. And I suppose it's a very young wine, and with time, I think you could keep this certainly a year or two. Those characters might join a little bit more seamlessly. But as it stands, I think this is the type of rosé that isn't probably designed for sipping by a poolside, but having, you know, with lunch or with a meal or with some canapés. It's something really to interest people who like fine wines and also exploring rosés. And I think one thing I didn't want to talk about is the Paydoc being cheap, but what I was trying to stress was relative value. Well, we looked at that Languedoc rosé from Gérard Bertrand being £200, and then if you look at the real pioneer in barrel fermented rosé, being Garus from Château d'Esclans, the maker of Whispering Angel, and that sells for around £100. Then this is a barrel-influenced rosé, pale pink and dry, from the Mediterranean at £20, is relatively cheap. In fact, you'd have 5 bottles of this for one of Garus, or 10 for one of Clos de Temple from Gérard Bertrand. So it does offer relative value. It is a good example of a style of wine that this part of the world does make to a high level, and it is a style of rosé that is gaining a bit of traction. So I think it is relevant, and I certainly know from talking to Moet Hennessy that one of the reasons why they were excited about the work that had been done at Château d'Esclans and why they then bought a 55% share of the property was because of the premium rosé segment. They really felt there's opportunity to expand that, and the premium rosés at Château d'Esclans are mostly influenced in some way by actually quite a high proportion of new oak. They have some of that creamy vanilla character. And I think, just as a final point on that, talking about oak and rosé, that if you think that, you know, until fairly recently, the dominant demand for rosé was for an off-dry style, and, you know, you go back to the kind of, you know, 80s, 90s, Mateus rosé being noticeably sweet, and then Anjou rosé and other styles, and then the blush style rosés from California. They had, you know, residual sugar levels, you know, between 20-25 grams per litre. They were quite mouth-filling, quite textured, quite sweet. Now the pendulum has swung back to these bone-dry, delicate rosés. Well, people really don't dare make anything off-dry or label anything as being medium dry, or they're scared of people talking about sweetness. Well, how can you dial in some of the texture and creaminess? Well, oak influence. It adds that kind of vanillan character that adds a bit of sweetness and creaminess to what is a dry wine. So in a way, that's quite an interesting solution for that. I'm going to take some questions. I just want to sum up my views before I do. For those of you that do want to log off, I've been an hour, which is really what I aim to be, and you may have other meetings or Zoom requirements to attend to, or you may want to sit back and just help yourself to the rest of the samples and enjoy them. But really what I want to say is we know the success story that is rosé, and particularly in the UK market and the US too. There is a potential story to be told with rosé in Asia, I believe. And we know what has been the driver of premium rosé in recent history, which has been the pink wines of Provence. What is the future? That is a finite area with what is actually currently today, supply constraints on supply. So where next? The market's growing, the demand is growing, we know the benchmark style. Well, where next, in my view, is to look more closely at the neighbouring Mediterranean regions. That doesn't just include the Paydoc, but the focus of this masterclass is the Paydoc, and I believe this region is absolutely perfectly placed to sate a demand for pale, dry, high quality, fresh rosé at an affordable price. And if you're looking for something further, tick a box of wines that are authentic, that are made with Mediterranean grapes, and that are organic. And if not, have a bit of fun by exploring this vast region and trying something a bit different, because after all, we might find in a few years' time that consumers are tiring of Provençal lookalikes and want to have things like a Petit Verdot rosé, something made with Pinot Gris and barrel fermented, or really anything that the Paydoc can lay on, bearing in mind the free nature of the classification. So that's my feeling. I hope you have learned something. You may not agree with everything I've said, but I hope you've discovered some interesting wines, and I hope you have got a sense of the pink wine opportunity that is the Paydoc. Now, for some questions. I've been asked about flint glass rather than more protective leaf green or dark green. I think I used the comment earlier that you drink with your eyes. I think the colour for rosé is so important that people take the commercial decision that they want to be able to see exactly what they're buying, and the best way of displaying it is with these clear glass bottles. I think there probably is there's a small risk there of light strike affecting the quality of the wines. I very rarely try or taste Provençal rosé or any clear glass bottled rosé that's out of condition. These wines are designed to be drunk young. There should be fast turnover. I would personally say that, bearing in mind they have they're designed to be drunk young, there's quite a high turnover of rosé, that going flint is better from a commercial perspective. And actually, from a consumer perspective too, I think it's important, and quite often in consumer events warn people when it comes to rosé about colour. People get very set on it being pale, a pale pink, because they think that relates to a certain style and they associate it with Provence. But actually what they really need to look out for is the brightness and the pristine nature of the hue, and that when it starts to go orangey, that's when you need to be careful. And I do notice, particularly at this time of year when the new vintages are coming on, there are some very attractive discounts on rosés on the shelves, and I always check the vintage, and quite often it's an old vintage, and it's stuff that may have been stored under lights, not in the best conditions, and you can tell it's a bit orange. And in fact, there was one retailer I know selling, not a wine retailer, it was an expensive shop selling a lot of expensive rosé that had gone really orange, and I did stop them and say, you really shouldn't be selling such high priced rosé it looks like as though it's oxidized. But anyone who walked into that shop who knew a little bit about wine would be able to see that was a warning signal, orange, almost like brown rosé through the flint glass. So yeah, beware. But personally, flint I think is best. Screw cap versus cork. I've been asked about that. It's up to what you think your consumer would like. I don't have a preference. I think the good quality cork today is the best seal for wine, but you might take the view, why would you waste a very fine, good quality cork on an inexpensive rosé that's designed to be drunk young? You probably wouldn't. So there's maybe a small advantage for cork on sustainability grounds. I think cork has cleaned up its act, so if you're thinking cork versus screw cap in terms of wine faults, I wouldn't be so worried, but you might say cork is a little bit more sustainable than screw cap, because screw cap involves aluminium and bauxite, which is the ore of aluminium. To mine it is very energy intensive, but then screw cap is widely recycled and cork isn't, but cork's biodegradable. I don't take a strong view on it. I quite like fine rosé under cork, and I'm very at ease with inexpensive rosé under screw cap. Interesting that my wines are blends. It's a low potential Paydoc rosé. I think that's a really good point. It is the region of varietal wines, and most of mine are blends. I think there are two reasons for that. One, blends are increasing in the Paydoc. It's not what it's known for, but the number of blends. I think secondly, people tend to go for blends with rosé because it's a category where the wine is more likely sold on brand and appearance than it is on varietal, or grape variety rather. And the other reason is that you might find that maybe it's easier to achieve balance in rosé winemaking when you blend grapes. So you can blend in some for colour, some for fruit, some for acidity. So that may be the reason. It may also be the fact that actually I tasted quite a few varietal rosés, but the best happened to be blends. And the reason why the best, in my view, or in my tasting, my notes, my scores were blends, were for the reason I've just given you, which is that you can blend in balance and complexity by using different grapes. But that's just a view. This last thing, positive comments on the last one. I'm delighted. I think this is a really interesting wine. I think there's masses of opportunity to have fun with that, but it is going to be a niche proposition. It's going to be a hand sell, and I mean, you know, you do need to forewarn people. I think it's a little bit like barrel fermented Sauvignon Blanc. I mean, the great white Bordeaux's of the world, the wines from Pessac-Léognan and Grave, are barrel fermented Sauvignon and Semillon blends. But you know, most people who are used to drinking Sauvignon Blanc are used to something that's crisp, that's light, that's fresh. So if you give them something that's then got creamy oak in it, they're a bit shocked, and quite often they stand back and say, oh, that's not for me. And it's a bit the same with rosé. It's associated with something light, fruity, fun, maybe a bit frivolous, easy, refreshing, and then suddenly you have a wine that has some of that red fruit, some of that grapefruit acidity, and then this creamy oak, and you're thinking, what's going on here? It's not what I'm used to. So it is a bit unusual. It does need a hand sell, but I think these wines are really versatile. And actually, if you're thinking of some of those, someone's mentioned ceviche, I think that's a really good point. But you know, some of the challenges of matching wine with vegetables, you know, asparagus. Are we in asparagus season now? It's kind of around now. It's a challenge. Well, actually, a barrel fermented rosé could be a really good solution for some of those challenging flavours in vegetables. Maybe not so much asparagus, but something like artichoke is particularly a challenge for sommeliers. And you know, why not look at a barrel fermented rosé? I mean, I was just doing a thing recently on wine and steak, and I was asked about what wine I might serve with steak tartare, and actually I chose a barrel fermented rosé. I thought that would be a really interesting match. Bear in mind that you're not just having the raw steak, but you're having flavours with it, spice, maybe Tabasco, capers. So it's quite challenging. So yeah, definitely a very versatile style of wine, and an exciting find from the Paydoc. Final question: are the slides available? Yes, we can send you the slides. I might have to edit out a few images where I'm not 100% sure they're my own or they're ones I've bought. But yeah, in terms of all the information I've shared, delighted to let you have it and use it as you need. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I really enjoyed today's tasting, and I'm looking forward to being able to drink these later with my colleagues or maybe my wife. And I hope you will too, and hope to see you all again soon in person. But for now, thank you very much.